Thing that we're going to talk about is the effects that the government can have in the loanable funds market. Let's take a look at if the government has a budget surplus. If the government has a budget surplus, then we actually have a divergence of the supply of loanable funds curves. We actually the actual amount of savings that people continue to put in the bank doesn't change. So that amount stays as the private supply of loanable funds curve. But we have an increase in the supply of loanable funds curve as a whole because the government has extra money that it can lend out. So the horizontal distance between these two curves is what is known as the budget surplus. That's by how much it actually increases. Now the effects of this are as follows. The total quantity demanded and supplied of loanable funds increases because we have a decrease in the interest rate. Firms are going to say, hey, now my capital, any investments that I make, is more profitable. So let's go ahead and invest. So we have an increase in the quantity demanded of investment, so increase in the quantity demanded of loanable funds. But we have a decrease in private saving. Because this real interest rate is decreased, now people don't want to save as much. It would make more sense to go and consume something instead. So it decreases private savings. And as I mentioned before, the horizontal distance between these two curves is what is equal to the government budget surplus. When we talk about a government budget deficit, the government needs more money, so we're actually going to see an increase in the demand for loanable funds. But expected future profits have an increase, so the private demand for loanable funds hasn't changed. What firms demand in terms of loanable funds hasn't changed. So we see a divergence in the curves. We have a private demand for loanable funds, and we have a demand for loanable funds for the economy as a whole, which includes the government budget's deficit. The horizontal distance between these two curves is the budget deficit. The effects of this are that it decreases investment, increases savings, and we're going to see something known as a crowding out effect. So the private investment actually decreases to the point of the old demand for loanable funds curve. And that's because, again, like I mentioned, the change in expected profits has not occurred. So the firms are actually still on this old demand curve, the old demand for labor, demand for loanable funds curve, which I'm going to call the private demand for loanable funds curve. And so, because the real interest rate has increased, we're going to see a decrease in the demand for loanable funds, the quantity demanded of loanable funds for firms. So, private investment decreases from its original equilibrium quantity. The total quantity of loanable funds that are demanded and supplied in the market as a whole still increases, though, because the government needs this money. So, we're actually going to see an increase in the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds. And as I mentioned before, again, we're actually going to have that horizontal distance equal to the budget deficit. Savings is also increased to the point of the equilibrium quantity of the loanable funds. And that's simply because the interest rate has risen, so we move to a higher point on the supply curve. The supply curve doesn't change, but we move to a higher point. And crowding out is simply this decrease in investment that we see, this decrease in private investment that we see due to a government budget deficit. The Ricardo-Barrow effect is actually a very interesting idea because it states that the government budget deficit does not actually change investment. It states that taxpayers expect this increase in tax due to this government budget deficit in the future, so they actually save more now. What it's saying is that increased savings is what finances the government budget deficit, and so the quantity of investment does not change. Let's take a look at how this actually works graphically. So we actually have an increase in the demand for loanable funds. We have the divergence between the private demand for loanable funds and the demand for loanable funds for the economy as a whole. We already saw that in the last slide. And we also have a decrease in the private investment. We have a total quantity of loanable funds that's actually increased because of the government demanding more quantity of loanable funds. But now what happens is that we actually have an increase in the supply of loanable funds, and it's going to increase by the same amount as the government budget deficit. So it's going to bring that real interest rate down back to its original point. And so what happens is that firms, because the real interest rate is now the same, it hasn't changed, they still demand the same amount of loanable funds. They're still going to be on that private demand for loanable funds, but because the interest rate is the same, they're still going to be demanding the same quantity of loanable funds to finance their investment.